Recently, we've seen a lot of silly exercises on social media, and this is one of the worst types of exercise that you can do. First of all, I'm a big proponent of impulse training. What is impulse? It's a change in momentum as a result of force. We have impulse trainers here in our facility we're going to show you in this video that are a much safer way to introduce some impulse into your training. But we're going to break down why this is not what you need to do, even if it's the most popular thing on social media right now. We've seen that this type of exercise where there's a strap attached to an immovable object, and then athletes are actually going into it and then slamming forward. Now, first of all, that in no way replicates the impulse load that occurs when you throw. There's a phase of the throw where your arm externally rotates and it slows down and changes direction from external rotation to an internal rotation. And that's an eccentric to concentric action for the most part. And the impulse is applied gradually over a period of time. Now, the faster you throw, a little bit faster that impulse is applied, but it's applied in a totally different way and totally different position than this, where the impulse is applied on the concentric, the forward-moving part of the exercise. So it's totally non-specific to what we're actually trying to train when we throw. And the muscles, because there's no resistance, and then they hit a huge impulse, they actually don't have time to co-contract and stabilize around the joint. So while, on the surface level, it may seem like this is something that you ought to be doing, it's really not specific to throwing at all. And we've seen a couple athletes already that have attempted this type of exercise and flared up their elbows. So you want to stay away from this. As a doctor of PT, I would strongly discourage anybody, especially with a history of shoulder or elbow injury, from even attempting to do this sort of training. But we're going to show you some impulse training that you can actually implement into your training if you have access to an impulse trainer or a flywheel like what we have here. And then also some things that you can do if you don't have that. So let's jump right into it. So we have impulse trainers like this where the sled is moving back and forth. The nice thing here is that there's an amortization phase where that body has time to adapt and stretch and overcome the sled moving back and forth. So the faster you move, the more difficult the exercise, and you can even do it with slack in the rope that does replicate a little bit of a higher impulse, but with a lower load where you're not moving against an immovable object. So this is a type of training we do, and there's a plethora of different exercises we can do with it. And let me even show you what I'm referring to here. So you can even do something like this, where the impulse is higher and we let slack get in the rope, but we're moving against 2.5 pounds of inertial load on this sled as opposed to an immovable object. Doing it against that immovable object is totally different than something that has a little bit of a give to it. And even then, I would argue that the first way that Dom was demonstrating is much more specific to what we want as a throwing athlete. Now, a ball wall throw is a great adaptation. You can start to train the shoulder for more impulse control and better acceptance of load in a sport-specific position without putting yourself in a position that's going to be more susceptible to injury. This is something we do from a rehab setting, late-stage rehab. Now, what's the best way to start to apply sport-specific impulse to your arm? And that's throwing. Throwing is going to apply sport-specific, the most specific impulse to your arm. The most important thing for us in those initial phases is getting you ready to accept the loads of throwing. But then once you can accept the loads of throwing, meaning you can throw pain-free, you're in a period of your training regimen where you are throwing, throwing is the best way to train your arm to accept impulse, and it's going to be much safer than what you're going to do with any sort of training regimen. Now, if you're not throwing because you're in rehab, maybe you need to gradually introduce yourself with a rebounder throwing activity or something like that to get you ready for this. Or maybe we want to limit your throwing so we can still apply inertial loads to the arm, but ultimately you're never going to replace throwing, and you should be careful in what you do in your training that it doesn't expose you to unnecessary risk of injury. If you guys want a training program that's been dedicated, basically built out for this exact reason of preventing injury but maximizing your performance, check us out, overheadathletics.com. We're happy to work with you.